And we are live now.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to everyone joining this third and the concluding webinar in this series. Today we have Jorge Chediek from the Office of South-South Cooperation to provide us the opening remarks. And the Office of South-South Cooperation has been at the forefront both of the programmatic response, but also of the policy dialogue in relation to the response to the COVID-19. So, Jorge, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Artemi. Good evening to you. Good morning from New York, fellow panelists. First, we are dealing with an unprecedented situation. There's no textbook, there's no history book that can tell us or can give us precedence of what we are experiencing today. Because we had pandemics, we had global crises, we had situations that affected the global system, but we didn't have the three interacting together at the same time. So basically, we are dealing with a new reality. And the first phase has brought, in some cases, some very good answers regarding how the multilateral system can respond to this type of challenges. And I will speak from the dimension of South-South cooperation. This emergency came from the South. It took place for the first time in a southern country like China. And at this stage is a little lost in the history, but initially over 79 countries cooperated with China, the majority of which were from the global South, providing technical assistance, providing material support, etc. So the initial reaction of solidarity was very good. And now that the pandemic has become a global phenomenon, we also have a lot of southern countries and China itself becoming major providers of assistance to other countries to deal with the effects of this situation. China is collaborating now with 82 countries. But as I was saying, India established funding mechanisms and has donated medicines and medical equipment to many other countries of the South. Countries with less resources like Bangladesh, Afghanistan committed funding for the global WHO fund. So these platforms or these mechanisms are providing spaces for southern countries to collaborate with each other. So there is a reality that South-South cooperation is taking place in the context of this pandemic and the response. And actually this was called for in the Buenos Aires +40 outcome document, which says that South-South cooperation should be activated to respond to this type of global challenges. At the same time, there are problems. There are problems because the crisis, as we mentioned, is totally unprecedented in dimension and complexity. So, number one, the multilateral system is totally strained. Our Secretary General is calling constantly for more engagement and more commitment to the multilateral system, but sometimes some countries are not engaging as strongly as it is, and some of the institutions are not really fulfilling the multilateral role because they are in strong tension within themselves through the member states. So we have to really take this opportunity to rethink the multilateral system, particularly considering that this type of situation is the one that we have all the world a common enemy, which is this virus. Jared Diamond was mentioning this, that is like in the movies that you have an alien force coming to attack the earth, and it should be an opportunity for all of us to get together. And so far, the jury is still out if we are succeeding. And actually there are many instances where we're not getting there. Then there is a big issue answering the question of the seminar, which is what are the next steps, particularly for the Global South. The premise of the development process was the idea of utilizing the advantages of globalization to improve the quality of livelihoods of the populations of the global south. But the globalization process will be seriously questioned by the pandemic. We are already seeing that the volume of trade will be reduced, probably because the integration of the global production changes will be reversed in a way. As you know, several of the developed countries are even financing countries to bring back production capacity to the home countries, in a way breaking the mechanism of trade, investment, and technology transfer that this represents. One of the fastest growing industries in terms of income and generation of employment, tourism, will be seriously affected. So basically, we have to really rethink how this pandemic affects the globalization model under which we had some hopes for the development of the South. This also has enormous consequences at the financial level. We're seeing countries of the North taking unprecedented measures in terms of fiscal and monetary policy. The United States, where I am living now, is probably going to undertake a budget deficit of 15 points of GDP, most of which will be monetized by the Federal Reserve. And similar situations are going on in Japan with the BOJ, the Bank of Japan, and in Europe with the European Central Bank and the issuance of common bonds. So what will happen with this overhang of debt after the crisis? And what will happen with the debt of the countries of the South? Will be this followed by a new wave of austerity? And the overhang can become a disastrous situation for many countries of the South. We have to welcome the initiative of the G7 to postpone the payments of the debts to the IMF and the World Bank until the end of this year, with possibility of extending it until the end of next year, but more structural measures will be required. So I would need, and I'm very interested from here to hear from these great panelists that will follow me in my capacity of UN Office for South-South Cooperation, because this year, later in the year, we're supposed to have the South Summit, where developing countries should come together. And now with this situation of the pandemic and its effects, I think the agenda has to be very different, more radical, with more deep proposals to really undertake changes and adapt the reality of the countries of the South to the phenomena that will be generated by this crisis. So I think that I salute again Stefan and the Center for organizing these events, and also look forward to listening from the intellectuals that participated already and are participating after us, because we need new ideas, because we're dealing with a new world, and many of the traditional parameters are going to be seriously questioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorge, for this comments and also for reminding us of the Pipa plus 40 commitments. And indeed, during our first discussions, we were talking about the fact that a lot of what we, from what we see right now, are actually continuation of the trends and the commitments that we saw before. And also thanks a lot for framing the discussion from the point of view of South-South cooperation. Now, before I hand over to the panelists, I wanted to say two things. And the first one is related to the questions. You have two options for the questions. You can first raise your hand. There is an option for this. And the other option is to ask your question through the chat. I can see some of you already actively doing it. We will not be able to answer all of these questions directly or by the panelists right now, but we will definitely collect them and pass them to the panelists so that they will be able to engage after the webinar. The other point that I wanted to make is that this is the third webinar from the series, but we start thinking of what we could potentially do as a follow-up, and we look at the possibility of organizing a series of more focused discussions that would look at some specific themes. Some of the themes that we have in mind are such like themes as socioeconomic impact and the role of development cooperation, or, well, some of us, Stefan and myself, we were at the meeting that COIC organized on response to COVID-19. So we were thinking on what are the implications for development agencies as well as the UN development agencies in this context. Some of the participants raised the importance of aid coordination and aid effectiveness on the ground, and what are the implications at the country level. So these are just some of the suggestions, and I would also like to invite you to offer your suggestions through the chat or later by email. And now I would like to give the floor to our panelists, starting with Tony Pipa from the Brookings Institution. Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Artemi. Thank you, and thank you to you and colleagues for putting on this webinar today and for the invitation. And thank you, Jorge, for your comments in opening and setting the framing. And certainly, I mean, just one thing to comment. Obviously, this is still very early in this crisis. This is going to take some time, and so it's kind of hard to be able to comment exactly what will happen at the end of this, because we're still have a lot of uncertainty as to how long and how deep the implications will be. But I think it's important for us to be thinking forward. And to my mind, picking up a little bit on Jorge's comments, I think that this is a time of both great opportunity and danger for the multilateral system. As he mentioned, this is a common enemy, and so that raises and elevates the importance of global cooperation. It's very apparent how important global cooperation is to this. As the UN Secretary General has said, until we stop this everywhere, it's not stopped anywhere. And so that the very basis for what it means is there. At the same time, you've seen so many tensions and fragmentation and geopolitical competition happening that it's been, I think, very difficult for the multilateral system to nimbly and effectively respond, and it's under great pressure. I can envision one scenario where the competition between US-China, which is continuing to spill out into the multilateral system, continues to undermine its ability to be able to react, continues to call into question trust in the system's effectiveness to be able to respond, even potentially reduces support. And of course, the US has already been talking about and has frozen funding for the WHO. And you can see a scenario then in which donors and traditional donors from the OECD, DAC, and others sort of revert more to bilateral assistance. They seek out like-mindeds. You see smaller clubs of like-mindeds working together. You see South-South cooperation happening over here, the DAC happening over there, and it sort of continues a fragmentation and almost a sidelining of the overall system. You could envision another scenario where, because the importance of global cooperation has been elevated so much, that you see, and it's, you know, coming up on the 75th anniversary of the UN, you see a recommitment actually to the very founding principles, and a renewed focus on the importance of norms and the importance of coming together around how to envision a global system that works for everyone. And you could see something like a leaner, bolder system with better buy-in from major stakeholders. I think we're still at sort of we don't know which way it will go yet. I think it's trending toward the negative, unfortunately. But I think that's the jury's still out, and you see some very positive things. And Jorge mentioned, you know, the G7 and the G20 and conversations happening there. I think at the very least, you'll see a middle path, a renewed call for reform and streamlining and the rationalizing of multilateral organizations. I would hope there's more motivation to review things as a system rather than as individual agencies or individual or international organizations. Even within the UN system, for example, look at the food security types of agencies that actually have a hand in that. And we don't often take a step back and say, how would we rationalize that? How would we think of all of that? Perhaps this provides some motivation for doing that. I think it highlights how out of date our political structures are for the actual financial development cooperation. The heart of that, and we always go back to official development assistance and the OECD DAC, but ODA's share of financial flows into developing countries has already been significantly reduced over the last 10 to 15 years. And the size of this catastrophe and the size of financing that's going to be necessary to actually respond and to recover, I think ODA is going to come under significant pressure within donor countries. As Jorge mentioned, the huge stimulus packages that developed countries themselves are putting forward. And in fact, you're going to set up some kind of competition almost between local governments and state governments, and then assistance that's going internationally. The US's first relief package had very little actually for development assistance and humanitarian assistance going internationally, especially relatively compared to the $2.2 trillion that were being deployed just domestically. And I think it continues to, you know, you'll start to continue to hear questions about just sort of the fundamental basis for ODA. I think we've already seen some ministers calling for consideration of emergency funding, for example, that went from the US to Australia or the UK to Australia in the wildfires, saying, shouldn't that be considered ODA, even though it's not going to a developing country? It's going for emergency purposes. This is response. Why shouldn't we be thinking of that in terms of like how we think about ODA? And I think you're going to see that conversation actually continue to pick up steam. And I think then it calls into question sort of what's the difference between South-South cooperation and ODA? Why do we have these distinctions? Where is there not a political structure where we're starting to think about these things as a similar rather than a different thing? And, you know, even the agreements for the SDGs and the Climate Paris agreements were already blurring the lines between developed and developing. This is global solidarity. This is about solidarity writ large. Why are we not thinking about our financial assistance in this way? I think you're going to see continued calls and questions for that. And I think coming back to ODA, it requires us to think about what is the business case for ODA? What will ODA, what will be the distinction for ODA as a much smaller piece of the financial puzzle to be able to react to this? We're going to have to start thinking about what's the business case in the current context. More and more as a catalyst, what does it mean to be the venture capital of the COVID recovery? And I think it's time for us to actually have an honest conversation about the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, the idea of TOSTI. I don't think these things have political weight and traction at the level that we really need them to have. And so out of a catastrophe and a crisis like the size that this is, perhaps it provides us the political opportunity to really take a fair look and start from scratch and think about what new political structures there can be. And I think you see that reflected in one of the ways I mean that the sort of how out of date our political structures are for development cooperation. We have the traditional OECD DAC, which, you know, is sort of the caretaker of ODA. But what is the real political structure for the development finance institutions? Because the real game is now development financing. It's not necessarily grant-based one-to-one investments.
2 minutes left.
And you see the Development Finance Alliance, Development Finance Institution Alliance with the European and the Global North Development Finance Institutions. You see the IDFC. You know, shouldn't we be coming together and creating a body where we've got the real major stakeholders and players of development financing thinking and working together, and not just in a transaction sense, but also the political sense. What does it mean politically for us to be working together and to be cooperating? Just a couple of other things, just a couple of other thoughts on how we can strengthen the momentum for strengthening global cooperation rather than undermining it. One is to leverage leadership from lots of different actors that actually are cooperating well globally. The scientific community, for example, universities, engineers that are actually really looking and working together to innovate. Local government leaders. You had mayors, for example, convene through C40 and talk and exchange lessons and exchange knowledge. How do we leverage actually the strong city-to-city networks and leadership that mayors have created globally and bring that into the traditional multilateral system and influence it? And then I think we do need to identify who the diplomatic champions are here, who can bring China and the US to the table to work more constructively together rather than at odds. I think the Secretary General himself has an opportunity here to convene some major thought leaders on what a new renewed system might look like for the UN and under his own mandate, so to put some ideas together. I'll leave it there.
Excellent, thank you very much, and especially for this conclusion, because I think this is one area where it was very relatively easy to identify problems, but very difficult to suggest some concrete solutions. So thank you very much for doing exactly this. And thank you very much to all the participants. Now we have more than 200 for contributing questions and suggestions for the follow-up. And now I would like to give the floor to Imme Scholz from DIE, German Development Institute. Imme, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Artemi. I would like to, I think what I'm going to say builds very nicely with what Tony said and also Jorge. So just to get clear, the first thing, when we speak about the Corona crisis, what do we mean? I think there are three layers or three phases: the public health emergency, the severe social and economic effects due to the stop of the world economy, which has been described, and especially on poor countries and on the poor sectors or the informal sectors of the population. And this applies both to rich countries and poor countries. And then I think what a layer we also have to consider is that this conjunction might lead again, like in the financial crisis, to a weakening and a failure of public services because of diminishing tax revenue and so on, and also the decreasing trust in public institutions. And this is, I think, quite dangerous. We're seeing it already in the multilateral system, as has been mentioned, but I think this could get worse. But this is, as Tony said, we don't know where this is going, because we're also seeing that populist governments are revealing some incompetence actually in dealing with the crisis. So in that sense, this is not clear where we're going to. But as Natalie Tocci from the Italian Institute of International Affairs wrote a few weeks ago, this conjunction and these effects of the crisis, of the Corona crisis, could be a final blow to the EU. It could be a final blow to the system of multilateral cooperation and of international law, or it could ignite a process of public debate where we rediscover the need we have of international cooperation. And I think what is at the heart of this is also the need to redefine the relationship between what is public good, what is the common good on the one hand, which is provided by the state, by public policies and institutions, and among them international cooperation, and on the other hand, the market. So the relationship between what is public, what is private, and what do we actually need to change to ensure that common goods are not harmed, and that societal values are respected. And I think that this is the systemic, what I call the systemic dimension of the corona crisis. And because what we see is that an enormous vulnerability of our societies in the North and in the South to the crisis, to the corona outbreak, and this, I think, has systemic roots. And we need to understand them well so that the public and private investment in the recovery process afterwards is well directed, so that it addresses these sources of vulnerability in order to make our societies and economies more resilient, more inclusive, as the Agenda 2030 says, and to also make our societies and our economies and our political institutions more resilient, make them more able to prevent future crises and to manage them when they have not been avoided. So if we look more closely at the corona crisis now, what are the systemic causes and its systemic dimensions? We have heard, Jorge, you mentioned Jared Diamond. He says that the virus as such stems from remote biodiversity hotspots. And this reveals that our systems for biodiversity protection are weak and dysfunctional. And also, I think this is the first factor. The second is the systemic factor. The second is that controlling the destructive impacts of COVID-19 requires well-equipped and universally accessible health systems and infrastructures, social safety nets. But in reality, they are underfunded, they are not accessible for everybody, and often lack quality. And third, we see that the crisis requires well-working international cooperation based on shared norms for emergency relief and for mitigating economic fallout. But as has been mentioned, UN organizations are underfunded. Many countries prefer bilateral action instead of multilateral cooperation, or openly are putting their nations first. And I think that this complexity of the COVID-19 crisis is typical for the average crisis we will be facing repeatedly in this century. So this is unprecedented, but it will not remain the only one. We will face situations like this repeatedly in the health system, but also in other areas like climate change. So to be able to preserve the common good will require to understand the complexity of these crises and to understand that it requires more than economic and financial measures. And so in this sense, I would like to echo what the United Nations Secretary General's report on the socio-economic effects of the COVID crisis stated. He said, a hard truth is that we could have been better prepared for this crisis. We could have been better prepared. The MDGs and the SDGs could have put us on track towards a world with access to universal health coverage and quality health care and more inclusive and sustainable economies. And I would add, better prepared for the climate crisis and better prepared for protecting biodiversity. And I think this is important to keep in mind, because the 2030 agenda was exactly created to address urgent processes of change, or to prevent crisis, so to achieve prosperity for people within the limits of the planet. And I think that, and I would add the Paris Agreement to this, specifically dedicated to prevent dangerous climate change. And both agendas are combine national responsibility and international cooperation. In that sense, the universality of these agendas are important, as Tony has also mentioned. And important thing is also that these, the average crisis in the 21st century will be global in nature. It will have different causes. It will affect those who have not caused it, but it will be global in nature, and it will affect those future generations and their life chances as well. So how to deal with the emergency and its systemic effects? My thought proposal is that when we want to understand the corona crisis and want to deal with it, it is beneficial to think for governments and for people to think about response measures in the spirit of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement too. Because both challenges, the COVID challenge and the sustainable climate compatible development challenge, they share these significant characteristics as being global in nature and requiring universal, integrated, transformative responses. So what I think is important is that the heavy mobilization of public funding to mitigate social and economic impacts will have to be spent in a way that they also contribute to the 2030 Agenda and to climate policy. So to imagine a sustainable and inclusive, a green recovery. And this is important. It needs to be inbuilt into recovery programs because otherwise there will not be much public funding left. And this applies especially to what we are used to call the donor countries. If you look at the huge amounts which are being mobilized, it is the danger is there that the focus on the immediate economic recovery, for example, could lead us to clearly miss the time targets in these other agendas.
2 minutes left.
Yeah. So I think that we need to focus on a 2- or 3-pronged approach. And this is for dealing with the causes and the effects of the corona crisis. And this is especially demanding for development cooperation, but for the public sector as a whole, because most of the political and the financial energy now goes to emergency relief, to the immediate reaction, and not much political energy is left for thinking beyond in the next phases. But I think if we really manage to focus on transformative recovery packages and transformative strategies, this would be a very big opportunity for moving climate policy, both mitigation and adaptation, as well as the policies for sustainable development, into the center of policymaking where they belong and away from the margins. I think the Green Deal in the EU could be seen as a first step. So in a sense, what I want to say is that the SDG framework remains fit for purpose as it aims at increasing societal resilience. And I think this is a focus we need. What do we mean? What we need for societal resilience and the capacity at the same time to act globally in an effective manner where it is needed, without losing time and without losing the manifold dimensions of these complex crises in the 21st century out of sight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imme, and it's really important to maintain this sort of outlook that includes other issues. It's extremely difficult to do it during the times of the emergency such as this, but nevertheless, it's extremely important to keep this perspective. So thank you very much for this important reminder. All right, so before I give the floor to Sachin, I want to say that we also had another speaker announced in the program. It was Elizabeth Sidiropoulos from South Africa. She unfortunately wasn't able to join this webinar. So with this, I would like to welcome Sachin Chaturvedi from RIS in India. Sachin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Imme. Thanks, Stefan. I must congratulate both of you for putting this extremely fascinating discussion for last 3 sessions together. And I'm very glad that these discussions are available on YouTube. So fantastic arrangement. Congratulations. I join my fellow panelists, Jorge, Tony, and Imme, in terms of thanking you for this initiative. I think all 3 of them have very rightly at some point quoted the Secretary General. And that, I think, reflects the strong view of the panel to have faith in the UN architecture and faith in creating the global governance hovering around the UN system. So that, I think, is absolutely fascinating and I think very encouraging. I was quite impressed to see in BBC's Hard Talk when Secretary General said that way out from COVID-19 is through international cooperation. So I think we need to realize that the way out is not from nationalist and closing of borders, but by extending international cooperation. So I think having said that, we need to see how we go forward and how do we bring in greater transparency, accountability in our engagements at the global level. And from that point of view, whatever time I have, I would like to bring forward a couple of points which I think are extremely important. When we say international order matters and UN has to play a role, I think we should not forget that this is also the time when the global architecture, international arrangements are in the most dysfunctional format. The superpowers are not cooperating, they are not prepared to work together, continuous trade-offs are emerging, and that I think is a cause of worry. And that I think is also important in terms of how do we eradicate the challenges that we have in our sites. So from that point of view, a couple of initiatives that I think are important. The first one, of course, is as everybody has highlighted, the need to create global public goods. And global public goods, when we talk of in light of a pandemic like this, we need to see how R&D policy, how intellectual property, etc., is sort of looked into. But when I talk of these kind of initiatives, what also comes to my mind is the larger issue of this North-South divide that Tony alluded to. I think we should not forget and we should not miss out the socio-economic context from where most of the patients are coming in. And I was quite appalled to see the Afro-American death toll that is being reported from some parts of America. And this very clearly shows how ill-prepared some of our even advanced economies are, and they have their own stress to manage. So I do not see that we have time now to see this as a South or Southern problem or as a trade-off between North and South. And that, I think, brings in the larger question of role that multilateralism may play. And we are not unaware of the fact what state of affairs multilateralism is. Emma has very rightly elaborated that. But we require building of trust, we require building of partnerships, the engagement, the confidence, and of course, collective action that is needed for that. And from that point of view, the economies are not in best of shapes. The fact that forbearance of suspended repayment of official bilateral credit that IMF and World Bank have recommended to G20 countries and have decided to take it forward. What was discussed at G20, I think, is important. Jorge has referred to this point in terms of the huge current account deficit that countries have, and I think the Basel norms and other global norms would have to be seen how the countries get the maneuvering space to take a call on fiscal and monetary policy balances that are needed. And from that point of view, I think it is important that we bring in the trade dimension of it, the revenue dimension of it, and the resources that are important. And from that point of view, the whole discussion that is there to protect lives and livelihood, I think, is something that everybody is discussing, and we need to see that we continue to focus on that. But I see that this is also not the time to go back to our old debates of bringing in institutional architectures which are not accepted by the South. And this movement of weakness is across North and across South. And we should not get into the old ideas of bringing institutional architectures to thrust upon countries which are found to be weak, vulnerable, and helpless in this moment of crisis for them. And I do not think that those institutions which have not been accepted by the South should not be suggested to the South, or should not be suggested as a mechanism to move forward with. I also do not agree with the idea of SDGs to go forward in terms of revenue pooling within the framework, Tony, that you referred to as TOS-D. And I think TOS-D has certain reservations. I have written extensively about it. Many Southern actors have written about it. So I think we need to leave it where it is, and we should see that how in a harmonious manner, in a congenial manner, without trusting each other's ideas on development, we go forward. But definitely a bottom line that I see is in terms of bringing ethics back in the international debates, discussions, and the way we manage globalization. Unfortunately, the countries that are highly internationalized, the countries which are highly globalized, the countries which are engaged in trade thoroughly, if they do not alert other countries in terms of how we are going to go forward, we need to see that everybody has the moral responsibility, the ethics that are required, the human approach that is needed, the passion and the compassion that is needed for global governance, that I think is very important. Ethics have to come back to our approach, and not the transactional approaches that have prevailed in last a few years. We need to see that world goes back to the days of ethics and respect, both for human rights, but also for responsibilities, and that's where the ethics would bring in. South Korea, as Emma, you were mentioning, has done wonderfully well in terms of managing the crisis. The successful model may be shared. I also referred to R&D strategies, suggesting the open sourcing of innovation, trying to create global research platforms to see how we can evolve even simple protection gears that are needed by countries, the simple masks, the simple ventilators that are required. How do we reduce the cost of it? How do we go beyond the current supply constraints that are there? So bringing in larger access to issues, I think is extremely important. There are certain ongoing processes, the Delhi process in August, and of course the UNGA, HLPF and DCF, which probably would be down this year in terms of bringing forward the idea. Probably triangular cooperation and the idea would come back again. And here I think it is important to realize that we are not in the debate of aid effectiveness, we are into development effectiveness, and that development effectiveness is a point that we have been discussing for quite some time. As I want to close now, I think it is also the time that we review our status of debates on UN at 75. We need to rediscover UN. We need to recontextualize UN in light of the current experience and the failure of the multilateral institutions, the dominance of specific perspectives, specific actors, and if they become a football or soccer between the countries that are donating most, I think we would lose out the rationale and the purpose of the UN, and that I think is extremely important. And last suggestion, as I see way forward, is in terms of the teeth that we gave when we did this transition from GATT to WTO, that global trade governance got some teeth in it. I think time has come when global health governance require some teeth. WHO would have to be reconfigured in light of the moral responsibilities that I talked about. They require some global governance mechanisms that I think are needed in terms of how we manage and in what way we really go forward in terms of highlighting the dimensions of engagement from various perspectives, and that's where the role of multilateral institutions we need more rather than weakening. Only a connecting thread that I see here, and Jorge alluded to that, is in terms of the regional cooperation. Regional cooperation in at least physically congruous countries, like in case of South Asia, our Prime Minister decided to give $10 million in terms of this, and all countries cooperated. And look, we have created a fund of almost $19 million by generous support from Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, everybody, Maldives. So you have an example of how regional cooperation can really go forward. Germany's support in terms of the ECA in Africa, I think is another very important recent example. Just this morning, I saw this news of strengthening ECA through regional integration and management of the health crisis. So these are some of the fascinating regional cooperation examples. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Sachin, for this extremely excellent points, for reminding us on the ethical dimension, for bringing up this discussion on the multilateralism, and you also actually anticipated a number of questions that you will see in the chat, and I invite all the panelists to look at the chat. In the meantime, we will try to give the floor to some of the people who raised their hands, and I would first like to recognize Sandia Iyer. She has been raising her hand for longest time. Sandia, Yasmin will now try to unmute you. And 1 minute, please. We can hear you, yes.
There seems to be a problem with your microphone. We cannot hear you clearly.
Yes, unfortunately, there seems to be a problem.
My question was for Imme and also for Anthony. I'll just post my question because there's some audio issue which I'm not.
The problem with the mic. So, Sandia, I would suggest that you post your question in the chat because it's very difficult to hear it. So next, I would like to recognize Yukari Hori in Myanmar.
Please unmute yourself.
Yukari, go ahead.
Sorry, I might have pressed the button wrongly. I didn't have anything specific. Thank you.
All right, then we go to next hand. It's Isha Miranda.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, 1 minute, please.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah. My questions to Sachin is, one thing is I'm very concerned about the country-wise UNDP activities. I think it's UNDP has to strengthen the country-wise UNDP country officers as well as regional officers in order to face these COVID-19 programs coming up. And also I'd like to ask a question, why you and other organizations do not work much close with the WHO, past as well as even the currently, because I see that WHO is currently, or even recent times, always working very isolated. So I like to know what is the new potential future program that you all are thinking to work with the WHO in the regional wise, country wise, globally.
All right, thank you for a question on your perspective. And now, Andre. Andre.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Andre, go ahead.
Thank you, Artemi. Very briefly, thank you all the panelists for very interesting and insightful presentations. And I think there's an agreement here that globally we have failed in preparing for this pandemic, and development cooperation has failed as well. I mean, we see countries that are not even able to coordinate, let alone collaborate in their struggles against the pandemic. I mean, we have different standards and protocols in different countries, even in the same region, even within Europe, for gathering data and the like. And we have a dispute for medical equipment, and we have attacks on multilateral institutions. So all that has been mentioned. But I was wondering as well if there isn't something that's inherent to this crisis, which is very difficult to address in terms of collective global action, which is that we know it's going to happen, but we don't know when. And it's a very extremely rare event. I mean, we heard, you know, declarations by former President Obama, by Bill Gates, and by many scientists predicting that such a thing might happen, but we don't know when. And then the political incentives are not favorable towards preparation for that matter. So not just domestically, but above all globally, how could we prepare for such events which are so devastating, but at the same time are so unlikely and rare and difficult to predict? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. And I would also like to ask Maruf, but to be extremely brief because we need to start wrapping up.
Thank you very much. I hope you are hearing me. I was interested to know about the localization, because you know that when we talk about the development cooperation, localization means that if the local actors are enabled to work for their own locality, I mean, the development is always have its own priority and ownership. So how could be the scope of promoting this kind of localization, particularly in the post-COVID, I mean, post-pandemic situation in the poor countries across Asia and Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maruf. And there is a number of questions that we received on the chat, some that I would like to highlight. One from Mr. Kim Bopata in Cambodia on the role of development partners and UN agencies in promoting South-South cooperation for response to COVID pandemic and response to post-COVID and in building resilience. The speaker just now also asked about the regional cooperation. There is a number of questions that are related with the fact that a lot of people are concerned with the ODA budgets being reduced in a lot of countries, and whether they will be able to keep up to their commitments. Stefan, do you have any additional highlights from the chat box? All right. In such case, I would like to give a very short time for selective questions to all the panelists to respond. So maybe let's start in reverse order with Sachin.
Thank you, Artme. Thanks to all the participants. It was a pleasure seeing some old friends in the list. So it's a great privilege to be here. I think a couple of issues have come up which are quite interesting. The first and foremost that Sandhya raised in terms of multilateral institutions, and I was just seeing, though we could not hear her, but she has typed a question, and I was reading it in terms of the role of the multilateral institutions. And Sandhya, as I mentioned, it is extremely important, which brings me to also rope in Isha's question on what role WHO can play. As I mentioned in my initial remarks, the time has come now to bring health governance as one important area where we can really have the biting ability in the multilateral institutions. It can no more remain on the margins of global governance. We need to see how responsible and management with ethics is there. So that I think is important. Isha, you're absolutely right that WHO has also not made much efforts in terms of connecting with other institutions. If you look at another institution in Geneva, ILO, how much effort they have made to connect with others. Somehow WHO hasn't made that linkage that is important. Andre and Maruf, I think both have raised important points in terms of how do we localize and how do we enhance the a sort of efficacy of governance. And I think both these points are important in terms of the whole discussion and debates which we had right from MDG days to our transition to SDG in terms of localization, in terms of the common footprint. In India, for instance, a huge migration has happened from urban areas to rural areas and from metros to smaller semi-urban areas. This is something which has been a part of the centralization of our development paradigm. So how do we bring in local enterprises, local production centers with less carbon footprints, something that Emma very rightly reminded us in terms of our Paris commitment. And that I think is something now, if you go to Indian social media, you find a lot of pictures, how much Yamuna river has cleaned, how much clean skies are there, how much more you can hear the birds, etc. So this kind of commitment is emerging, and I think we need to see how we create job, how we create local enterprises, which then cater to local economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sachin. Now, Imme.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to respond to Andre de Melo's question. I think we have, human societies have many experiences with unlikely or difficult to predict emergencies like earthquakes, yeah, for example. And I think, and what here in Germany, a few years ago, the parliament prepared a crisis handbook to better understand what new types of crises and emergencies would require. And one was, and the second scenario in that was about pretty much the corona crisis we're facing now, yeah? And so it's interesting to see that the government is following in its measures, is following that, that handbook. But what we also see is that there are things we just didn't take into consideration. The difficulty in providing masks and material, for example. So what we learned from this is that we need to build reserve capacities, and we basically need a different perspective on what we consider to be efficient. Yeah. So efficiency calculations have to build in reserves, have to build in redundancies, yeah, and have to, because this is what we are missing in this current crisis. This is why the health situation turned into a calamity, because we did not have enough reserves. And because efficiency calculations were done in a very, were done without adequately considering the type of problems these institutions like hospitals need to, or basic health systems, healthcare systems need to cover. And I think that that is the one type of lesson. And the other one is how important it is to invest into inclusiveness of our societies and economies and labor markets to reduce vulnerability. Because the type of vulnerability we're seeing now is beyond relief and beyond emergency help. And this is the avenue into which we were brought with the 2030 agenda and which we have not taken seriously enough. And this includes, this is universal. This is the same, is similar also in the rich, so-called rich countries, but where wealth is concentrated with a few, and where inclusiveness is not a character, not a feature, not strong enough a feature as it should be. That would be my answer.
Thank you very much. Now, Tony.
Yes, thank you. And it's been a fascinating and robust discussion. And it's great to see old friends and also make new friends and being able to see what's happening through the chat. So thanks for the opportunity and for the very rich discussion. I think a couple of comments I would say, and I'll also come back a little bit to Andre's question. To build a little bit on the comments that I was making towards the end of my presentation, I think there is the possibility, this is a little bit of a distance possibility, but this is the possibility of say a UN moment, and to go back to first principles. And I think those first principles are about keeping the world safe and secure, and prevention is a big part of that. The UN was originally founded in the aftermath of World War II, and so we were thinking about war when we were thinking about safety. But we have a whole set of global risks now that face us as a planet. And I think we can go back to that first principle and say, we're about reducing modern risk. Those are health risks, that's bioterror, bioengineering, climate, nuclear, cyberspace, misuse of AI. There is a whole set that our multilateral efforts ought to be focused on. And it is about prevention, and it is about being ahead of those. And to that point, a first principle is also about norms and standards. It's, you know, we have loaded a lot of responsibility onto our international organizations in terms of service delivery and reach and distribution. But frankly, that's because they were so successful at the beginning around setting standards and norms and getting common agreement around that and getting the world to work on that. And I think actually that principle has been diluted somewhat within all of the other things that we're asking of these international organizations. So if we can get back to those first two principles, I think maybe we can build in some of the incentives to be able to be ahead rather than behind of crises like this.
Thank you very much, Tony, and now Jorge.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Also very interesting, the comments of the fellow panelists and friends, and also the comments we received in the chat. I will make 3 points. One is there is a lot of activity going on in the South to respond to this pandemic. Many of these activities are very creative, and we're trying through UNOSCC to support the sharing of that knowledge through our Galaxy platform. I know there are other platforms ongoing, but I invite all of us to try to coordinate each other, because I think we can really profit from the experiences of other developing countries and even from countries from the North. Secondly, I want to highlight, it was pointed out in several of the chats, triangular cooperation. It is very important, and I think it is a very valuable mechanism from countries of the North to engage in supporting these exchanges among countries of the South. And my last point is a reflection. Here we're all committed to multilateralism. We assume that multilateralism is good because we know even the philosophical moral underpinnings, and also we are aware of many of the successes. But in a way, this crisis, although as I said at the beginning, is made for multilateralism, has generated a different type of reaction, more of a circling the wagons at the national level and even the regional levels. One of the comments in the chat is a part of the discourse of the speech of President Macron, who's a champion multilateralist in the European context, which points out the importance of having a national dimension. And as I mentioned in my introduction, it is also reflected in trying to break the global production chains and nationalizing the production. So the point I make is we have to really put together a very good value proposition to leaders and to peoples of the world. Because as of today, because of the fact that the response has been less than optimal, instead of this being an opportunity for multilateralism and multilateral institutions to shine through, it has become a moment where the whole system is being questioned. So I think some of us who are champions, all of us who are champions, and know the importance of this, have to really elaborate on how it is relevant to this type of global crises, to future crises of this dimension, and also to building the better world. We need to do it because although ourselves are committed outside, for the first time, I think the other voices are predominating. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the participants also for taking part in this webinar. There are almost 200 of you who are bearing with us. And I would now like to give the floor to the director of the UNDP Seoul Policy Center for the quick wrap up. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, this was a great discussion. It's really amazing how this kind of, webinar format is working out with the discussions with our panelists, but also the chat function. This is not so much a wrap up, but let's say I'm trying to based and informed on our discussions today and during the last two webinars, how I would like to frame two main points we would like to put into a small, brief think piece. And just summarizing this would be like this. So my first point is, I think from the beginning we had this question, is COVID-19 a fundamental game changer? And let's say at the beginning that was also my assumption, or is it rather a super accelerator? Let's say the game changer function, just looking at the last three webinars, it's really difficult to identify those game-changing functions. So most of what I'm picking up from those discussions is that we see this kind of mega accelerator situation. But I think from a conceptual perspective, this question is not really easy. And I think it's also very important. So to have a better understanding about this point, I think it would be really make a big difference. My second point, and I'm really glad for Tony's reflection on it, I think we have at the moment different sets of evidence. One set of evidence that we are going to see more and better cooperation in the future. Yeah, everybody is convinced we need to provide financial resources for the provision of global public goods. We need to have a look at the weakest link in this kind of public health situation, etc., etc. At the same time, we see a further thinning of multilateral approaches. And I mean, just looking at the news every day, we find a number of examples in this regard. I think this kind of, this is a crossroad. I think this is one main aspect, but one other is we have a number of shades of gray between both options. Let's say forum shopping of a number of countries. This kind of maybe more emphasis on bilateral cooperation as an option to avoid one extreme. I think this is also very important because this would make a big difference for policymakers. My last point would be, I think it's really important, and also looking at some comments in the chat function, that we consider already this kind of recovery or reconstruction situation. And we have this kind of huge risk, I would say, that COVID-19 is narrowing our perspective. Yeah? How to overcome with a very short-term perspective some of the economic implications of the crisis. And this kind of quick recovery would bring the risk that those aspects we were, getting from the discussion last year with regard to climate change, biodiversity, Imme mentioned it, that we are losing it. And to make sure that this kind of, better recovery approach or smart recovery or green recovery is something what we are planning from the beginning. I think this is a very, very important dimension. Otherwise, it would be a much too narrow approach we would follow for the next couple of months and years. So that would be a bit my quick, abstract takeaway from those discussions we have had today and for the last two webinars. I found it really extremely inspiring, all our panelists, the audience, and thank you so much to my team. That was also great preparation. For us, it was, the first time that we organized something like this. I'm very positive about it because it provides much more, possibilities for global interaction. That's also great. Artemi mentioned already that we are currently considering how we will continue. Thank you for your proposals. What might be good topics in this regard? So we will get back to you with an update on how we want to continue this kind of discussion. And we would be glad to have you again here on the panel and in the audience. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Good night, good afternoon, and all the best to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I will be ending the webinar now.